There are some stories that feel more like myths than history, tales of sprawling empires, of emperors who seem more like marble statues than men, and of tragedies so vast they seem to defy comprehension. The story of the fall of the House of Habsburg, the dynasty that ruled over the heart of Europe for more than 600 years, is one such tale. It's a story we think we know, one that ends in the mud and fire of the First World War, with an assassin's bullet in a city called Sarajevo. But that is the end of the story. It is not the beginning. The real beginning, the crack in the foundation of this ancient and powerful empire, happened decades earlier. It didn't happen on a battlefield or in a council chamber. It happened in the velvet-draped bedroom of a remote hunting lodge with a man, a teenage girl, and a secret that the most powerful family in the world would do anything to bury. This is the story of Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria-Hungary, the man who should have been emperor, the man whose life was meant to be the empire's salvation, but whose death became its death warrant. To understand the gunshot that echoed from Mayerling in 1889, we must first understand the world that created the man who pulled the trigger. We must step inside the gilded cage of the Habsburg court, a world of suffocating tradition, breathtaking beauty, and unbearable loneliness. This is not just the story of a prince's suicide. It is the anatomy of a tragedy, the story of how a little boy, born to rule the world, was systematically broken by the very system he was meant to inherit. Imagine for a moment the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1850s, the decade of Rudolf's birth. It was a place of dazzling contradictions. On the grand avenues of Vienna, aristocrats in magnificent carriages rolled past coffee houses buzzing with the revolutionary ideas of poets, artists, and intellectuals. This was the city of Strauss and later of Freud and Klimt, a cauldron of creativity and modern thought that historians would one day call the joyful apocalypse, a final brilliant burst of cultural light before the darkness fell. But the Habsburg Empire was not a modern nation. It was a relic. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual feudal state, a sprawling patchwork of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, and a dozen other peoples, all held together by the singular authority of one man, the emperor. It was an empire built on three pillars: the army, the bureaucracy, and the Catholic Church. Its motto was Viribus Unitas, with united forces, but in reality, its forces were anything but united. Beneath the surface of imperial grandeur, the fires of nationalism were beginning to burn, threatening to shatter the fragile mosaic. The heart of this empire, and its greatest prison, was the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. Life here was not governed by whim or affection, but by a set of rules so ancient and rigid they were known as the Spanish court etiquette. This was a suffocating code of conduct that dictated every waking moment of the imperial family's life. It prescribed how they should walk, how they should talk, who they could speak to, how many steps they should take, and even how they should eat their soup. It was a system designed to elevate the monarch to a semi-divine status, but in doing so, it stripped him and his family of their very humanity. It was a world built to preserve tradition at all costs, even at the cost of its own children. At the center of this rigid universe sat Rudolf's father, Emperor Franz Joseph I. He had ascended to the throne in 1848, the year of revolutions, a moment of crisis that defined his entire reign. He saw liberalism, nationalism, and democracy not as forces of progress, but as agents of chaos that had to be suppressed. He was not a tyrant in the classical sense. He was something far more unyielding. He was, as he saw himself, the first bureaucrat of the empire. His life was a testament to punishing routine and iron self-discipline. He woke before dawn every day, prayed, and then sat at his simple iron desk for up to 10 hours, reading and signing an endless mountain of state papers. He wore the scratchy, restrictive uniform of an army officer from morning until night, even when alone. He ate simple boiled beef for dinner and slept on a narrow Spartan cot. He saw his role not as a leader of men, but as the chief administrator of a vast, complex machine. His personal motto was indefatigable devotion to duty, but this devotion came at a terrible price. Franz Joseph was emotionally impenetrable, a man who seemed incapable of expressing warmth or affection, even to his own family. He viewed his wife and children not as loved ones, but as dynastic assets, cogs in the imperial machine. He was polite, formal, and utterly remote. He communicated with his children primarily through his adjutants and saw his son Rudolf less as a boy to be nurtured and more as an heir to be forged. He loved his empire more than anything, but his rigid, backward-looking vision for it would ultimately become its undoing. He was a man of immense integrity and tragic short-sightedness, the perfect jailer for the gilded cage his son was about to be born into. If Franz Joseph was the iron anchor of the Habsburg dynasty, his wife was its wandering, restless soul. In 1854, he married his 16-year-old cousin, Duchess Elizabeth, in Bavaria. Known to her family as Sisi, she was a creature of the forest, a free spirit who grew up in the unstructured rural bliss of the Bavarian countryside. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with ankle-length chestnut hair, and a figure she would obsessively maintain through punishing diets and exercise routines for her entire life. Their union was supposed to be a fairy tale, but for Sisi, it was the beginning of a lifelong sentence. She was utterly unprepared for the suffocating atmosphere of the Hofburg Palace. She hated the rigid etiquette, the constant scrutiny, and the cold, critical judgment of the court, particularly from her powerful and domineering mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, who saw Sisi as a silly little goose unfit to be an empress. When Sisi gave birth to her first two daughters, they were immediately whisked away by the Archduchess, who declared that the young, flighty empress was unfit to raise them. Sisi was left with no role and no power. She retreated into a world of narcissism and escapism. She became a fitness fanatic, installing gymnastics equipment in her private chambers and undertaking grueling hours-long hikes. She wrote melancholic poetry in secret, comparing herself to a captured seagull, forever yearning for the sea. She spent months, sometimes years, away from Vienna, traveling on her imperial yacht, seeking refuge in Hungary, Greece, or England, anywhere but the court she despised. This profound unhappiness had a devastating impact on her children. She was a ghost in the nursery, a beautiful, distant figure who would occasionally sweep in, only to disappear again. And when her only son, Rudolf, was born on August 21st, 1858, she was determined to protect him. But she was fighting a losing battle against the imperial system and her own inner demons. She loved her son, but she was too consumed by her own misery to be the mother he desperately needed. Rudolf was born into a family presided over by an emotionally absent father and a physically absent mother. He was, from the very beginning, profoundly alone. The first few years of Rudolf's life were a brief, flickering moment of warmth in an otherwise cold existence. The imperial nursery was his world, and his older sister Gisela was his son. They were intensely close, a small island of childish affection in the vast, formal ocean of the palace. But the system was already closing in. The moment he turned 6, the walls of the gilded cage slammed shut. it was decided that the heir to the throne must begin his military education, and any childish softness was to be brutally stamped out. The man chosen for this task was Major General Count Leopold Gondricourt. What happened next is not just a story of a strict upbringing. It is a documented case of systematic child abuse, sanctioned at the highest levels of the state. Gondricourt was a man forged in the savagery of the battlefield, and he believed fear was the ultimate educational tool. His goal, he stated, was to turn the sensitive, imaginative boy into a hardened soldier, immune to fear and weakness. His methods were a form of psychological torture. Imagine being a small child, asleep in your bed, and being violently woken by the deafening roar of a pistol being fired right next to your ear. This was a regular occurrence for Rudolf. Gondricourt would then force the terrified boy to stand at attention in the dark, quizzing him on military drills. He subjected Rudolf to hydrotherapy, dousing him with ice-cold water to build his resistance. He forced him on grueling marches that lasted for hours in the bitter Austrian winter until the boy was blue with cold and on the verge of collapse. Any sign of fatigue or complaint was met with scorn and punishment. Perhaps the most infamous incident illustrates the calculated cruelty of this education. To cure Rudolf's fear of the dark and wild animals, Gondricourt had him taken to the Imperial Game Preserve at Lens in the middle of the night. There, he abandoned the young prince alone. He then had his men mimic the sounds of wild boars, letting the boy's imagination run wild with terror, convinced he was being hunted. He was found hours later, shivering, sobbing, and utterly traumatized. This went on for years. Rudolf became a nervous, anxious child, plagued by nightmares and panic attacks. He lived in a constant state of fear. With his father's approval and his mother often away, there was no one to intervene. This wasn't just hardening a future emperor, it was shattering a child's psyche. It instilled in him a deep-seated belief that he was fundamentally weak and flawed. It planted a seed of self-loathing and a morbid fascination with death that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Finally, after years of this torment, Empress Sisi returned to Vienna and saw what was happening to her son. Horrified, she issued an ultimatum to Franz Joseph. Either Gondricourt goes, or she would. For once, the emperor relented. Gondricourt was dismissed, and a new tutor was appointed, the liberal-minded Colonel General Joseph Latour von Thurnberg. The change was dramatic. Latour recognized the boy's sharp intellect and deep curiosity. He replaced the brutal military drills with a comprehensive education in liberal arts and sciences. He fostered Rudolf's love for natural history, bringing in experts like the ornithologist Alfred Brehm to teach him. Rudolf blossomed intellectually. He became a passionate and knowledgeable naturalist, a skilled writer, and a keen observer of the world. He started his famous mineral collection, a hobby that provided a sense of order and control in his chaotic inner life. This new education opened Rudolf's mind. It exposed him to the progressive ideas that were sweeping across Europe, ideas about science, reason, and individual liberty. It was this education that would later turn him into a political rebel, a secret liberal who dreamed of reforming his father's decaying empire. But the damage was already done. The years under Gondricourt had left indelible scars. While intellectually he was becoming a man of the future, emotionally he remained trapped in the terrors of his past. He was prone to bouts of deep melancholic depression, what he would later refer to in his diaries as his inner darkness. He had learned a terrible lesson in that cold, dark game preserve, that he was alone, that the world was a dangerous place, and that there was no one to save him. As he entered his teenage years and prepared to step onto the public stage, Crown Prince Rudolf was a paradox. To the world, he was the brilliant, handsome, and accomplished heir to a great empire. But in the secret, hidden corners of his own mind, he was still that terrified little boy, listening for the sound of a pistol in the dark. The foundation of his life was built on trauma, and it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came crashing down. He had survived the crucible of his youth, emerging not broken, but dangerously fractured. The paradox of the man, a brilliant, modern mind trapped in a damaged, melancholic soul, was now complete. As he prepared to step onto the public stage, he carried with him both the progressive ideas that could save his father's empire and the secret traumas that would ultimately destroy him. The boy's private war for survival was over. The man's public war against his father's world was about to begin. To the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the heir to the throne had one primary function: to be a symbol of continuity. He was expected to attend military parades, sponsor charities, make diplomatic visits, and, above all, to embody the conservative, Catholic, and dynastic values of the House of Habsburg. He was meant to be a perfect, polished reflection of his father, Emperor Franz Joseph. But Rudolf was not a reflection. He was a refraction. He took the light of his world and bent it into something new, something the old guard found terrifying. His liberal education had done more than just heal some of the wounds of his childhood. It had given him an ideology. He was a rationalist, a man of science who believed in empirical evidence and logical deduction. This put him immediately at odds with the mystical, tradition-bound dogma of the court. He saw the empire not as a divine inheritance, but as a complex political entity that needed to adapt to survive in the modern world. His closest intellectual companion was not a fellow aristocrat, but a man his father's court deeply distrusted. Moritz Scheps, the brilliant and influential editor of the liberal newspaper Neues Wiener Tagblatt. Scheps was Jewish, a self-made man, and a fierce critic of the government, everything the Habsburg establishment feared and despised. In Scheps's salon, Rudolf found the intellectual family he never had at the palace. He would spend hours there, secretly meeting with journalists, professors, and politicians, passionately debating the future of Europe. It was in this circle that the heir to the throne was radicalized, solidifying his belief in parliamentary democracy, universal education, and the separation of church and state. Denied any official role in government by his suspicious father and the powerful arch-conservative prime minister, Count Eduard von Taffe, Rudolf was a man brimming with intellectual energy and political passion, yet given no outlet for it. He was a prince with a modern mind, forced to live by a medieval code of silence and obedience, but that energy had to go somewhere. So if the system would not give him a voice, he would steal one. Rudolf found another outlet for his political passion. He became a secret journalist. This wasn't a casual hobby. It was a dangerous double life. Imagine the scene. The heir to the 600-year-old Habsburg throne, a man whose every public move was chronicled, slipping out of the Hofburg Palace, perhaps in the unmarked carriage of a trusted friend, to travel to the bustling offices of his intellectual co-conspirator, Moritz Scheps. Here, in the smoky, ink-stained heart of liberal Vienna, far from the stifling etiquette of the court, Rudolf could finally breathe. He could be himself. Under a variety of pseudonyms, most famously Julius Felix, he began to write anonymous articles for Scheps's newspaper, the Neues Wiener Tagblatt. The content of these articles was political dynamite. This was not the gentle critique of a concerned noble. It was the roar of a radical. He fiercely attacked the privileges of the aristocracy he was born into, calling them a lazy, decadent class that was draining the lifeblood of the state. He saw their endless cycle of balls, hunts, and formal dinners as a grotesque spectacle of waste, while thousands of Viennese citizens starved in the squalid, overcrowded tenements of the working-class districts. He wrote with deep empathy about the plight of the urban poor in Vienna, describing in vivid detail the horrific conditions of the factories and slums, advocating for social reforms like public housing and workplace safety regulations that were decades ahead of their time. He was using his pen to wage war on his own class, a secret traitor to the gilded world he was destined to lead. The risk he was taking cannot be overstated. His primary political adversary, Prime Minister Taffa, was a master of the police state. His spies and informants were everywhere. Had Taffa's secret police definitively unmasked Julius Felix, the scandal would have been unimaginable. It would have been proof that the Crown Prince was not just a liberal, but a seditionist, actively working to undermine his own father's government. The consequences would have been dire: complete political isolation, a form of palace arrest, and the end of any hope, however slim, of influencing the empire's future. Most dangerously, he attacked his father's foreign policy. He saw the 1879 dual alliance with the newly formed German Empire not as a source of strength, but as a fatal trap. To understand the gravity of this, one must understand the mind of his father. Franz Joseph's entire worldview had been forged in the crucible of the 1848 revolutions. He saw the world as a constant struggle against chaos, and his greatest fear was the rise of Russian-sponsored Pan-Slavism, which he believed would tear his multi-ethnic empire apart. The alliance with a strong, conservative, monarchical Germany was, in his eyes, the bedrock of Austria's security, a bulwark against the Slavic tide. Rudolf saw it as an anchor dragging them to the bottom. With chilling prescience, he warned that tying Austria-Hungary's fate to the aggressive, militaristic ambitions of Bismarck's Germany would inevitably drag the multicultural empire into a catastrophic war with Russia and France. He saw that Austria was the junior partner in this arrangement, a glorified satellite state that would be forced to fight Germany's wars. He argued for a different path, an alliance with the Western democracies, France and Britain, and a peaceful reconciliation with the Slavic nations. He was effectively publishing treasonous material, a direct public assault on the core policies of his own father's reign. It was a classic generational conflict. The father, haunted by the ghosts of the past, clinging to an alliance for stability, while the son, seeing the storm clouds of the future, pleaded for a change of course before it was too late. Had his identity as Julius Felix ever been definitively proven, the scandal would have been unimaginable. His rebellion also focused on the empire's most volatile issue, the question of Hungary. The Compromise of 1867 had created the dual monarchy, giving Hungary near equal status with Austria. For Franz Joseph, this was a painful but necessary concession he made to hold the empire together. For Rudolf, it didn't go far enough. He was a passionate Hungarophile, a love inherited from his mother Sisi, who had always found refuge in Hungary from the stifling Viennese court. Rudolf saw in Budapest what he yearned for in Vienna, a vibrant, dynamic political culture. Unlike the Austrian aristocrats who viewed politics as beneath them, the Hungarian nobility were fierce parliamentarians. Their debates were lively, their press was freer, and their politicians seemed engaged with the modern world. For Rudolf, Hungary was a glimpse of the future. He spent as much time as he could there, cultivating deep friendships with Hungarian liberal politicians, learning to speak their language fluently, and championing their cause within the court. He dreamed of a future where the empire's center of gravity would shift from conservative Vienna to progressive Budapest. To the Austrian establishment, this was tantamount to heresy. It was seen as a betrayal of his German-Austrian heritage and a threat to the delicate balance of power. Every trip he took to Budapest, every friendship he made with a Hungarian leader, was seen by his father's court as another act of defiance, widening the already vast emotional and political chasm between the emperor and his heir. While Rudolf waged his secret political war, the court was consumed with a far more traditional matter, his marriage. His progressive ideas were dismissed as youthful folly. His warnings about foreign policy were ignored. His love for Hungary was seen as a dangerous eccentricity. To his father and the state, Rudolf had one primary biological function that trumped all others. He needed to marry and produce a male heir. At 22, the crown prince was still a bachelor, and the dynasty demanded an heir. The court saw marriage as the perfect solution to the Rudolf problem, a way to tame the young rebel with the responsibilities of family, to anchor him in tradition and duty. The search for a suitable bride, a Catholic princess from a reigning house, was on. The list of candidates was short, the criteria rigid. It was not a search for love, but a transaction of state. A bride was a dynastic asset, chosen for her bloodline, her faith, and her presumed fertility. The choice eventually fell upon Princess Stephanie, the 17-year-old daughter of King Leopold II of Belgium. It was a politically sound match, linking the Habsburgs to the wealthy and strategically important Belgian throne. But it also meant bringing a young woman into the Viennese court who was connected to one of Europe's most avaricious and brutal monarchs, a dark omen for a union that was destined for tragedy. On paper, the match between Crown Prince Rudolf and Princess Stephanie of Belgium was sound. Belgium was a rich, strategically important country, and Stephanie, at just 17, was young, healthy, and by all accounts, virtuous. She was a carefully selected broodmare for the Habsburg stud, chosen to perform the single most important function of any royal consort, to produce a male heir and secure the dynasty. But dynastic calculations rarely account for the complexities of the human heart, and from the moment the young princess arrived in Vienna in May 1881 for her lavish wedding, the union was beset by problems. Stephanie had been raised in the comparatively relaxed French-speaking atmosphere of the Belgian court. It was a world dominated by her notoriously cruel and avaricious father, King Leopold II. But it was a modern bourgeois court compared to what awaited her. She was utterly unprepared for the suffocating rigidity of the Hofburg Palace. Imagine a vibrant young girl, filled with the romantic hopes of any bride-to-be, suddenly thrust into a cold, silent world where every step, every word, every glance was dictated by a centuries-old code of conduct known as the Spanish court etiquette. It was a world of ritual, not of life. The Viennese aristocracy, a closed and haughty society that prized ancient bloodlines above all else, saw her as an unwelcome outsider. They found her unsophisticated, a product of a new money monarchy. They made fun of her youthful awkwardness and her French accent, nicknaming her the cool blonde and the plump little bumpkin. But the cruelest cut of all came from the one woman who could have been her greatest ally, her new mother-in-law, Empress Sisi. The Empress, a woman obsessed with her own ethereal beauty and intellect, found Stephanie to be plain, clumsy, and dreadfully dull. She made no effort to hide her contempt, treating her daughter-in-law with a frosty disdain that set the tone for the entire court. Stephanie was not welcomed into a family. She was delivered to a tribunal that judged her and found her wanting. Rudolf, for his part, seems to have made a genuine, if brief, effort. He was the most eligible bachelor in Europe, and he was initially charmed by her innocence and girlish shyness. In his letters just before the wedding, he wrote of his hope for a quiet, happy domestic life, but the reality of their life together quickly shattered that fantasy. The intellectual and temperamental gap between them was not a crack, it was a chasm. He was a complex, world-weary intellectual, a political radical who debated philosophy with journalists and corresponded with scientists. She was a conventional, religiously devout teenager whose limited education had focused on the traditional feminine arts of music, drawing, and piety. He tried to interest her in his books and scientific pursuits, bringing her his prized ornithological treatises or geological specimens, but she was uninterested, likely finding his intense intellectualism intimidating and strange. He in turn quickly grew bored with what he saw as her simple-mindedness and lack of curiosity. He began to treat her not just with neglect, but with a casual intellectual cruelty. At dinner parties, he would launch into complex political discussions with his friends, pointedly excluding her from the conversation. He mocked her opinions and belittled her interests. His letters from the time are filled with condescending remarks about her lack of intellectual depth, calling her a moral and spiritual heavyweight. He was a man drowning in a sea of existential despair, and he had been thrown a life raft he considered to be made of lead. The birth of their daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, in 1883, brought a brief period of domestic peace. For a moment they were united in the joy of parenthood. The empire celebrated. There was an heir, even if she was a girl, but the crucial goal, a male heir, a new Rudolf to secure the future of the dynasty, remained unfulfilled. The pressure from the emperor and the entire court mounted with each passing month. The marriage, already strained, now began to publicly disintegrate under the weight of this dynastic expectation. Rudolf retreated from the family apartments into a separate suite of bachelor quarters within the Hofburg itself. This was a constant public humiliation for Stephanie, a declaration that their marriage was a sham. He resumed his premarital lifestyle with a vengeance, indulging in a constant carousel of parties, heavy drinking, and affairs with actresses from the Burg Theater, dancers from the opera, and high-class courtesans. The marriage became a hollow sham, another gilded cage from which he desperately sought escape, leaving his young wife isolated and miserable in her own gilded cage down the hall. And it was in this world of reckless promiscuity that Rudolf sealed his own fate and that of his marriage in the most devastating way possible. In 1886, during one of his countless affairs, he contracted a venereal disease, almost certainly gonorrhea. It was a common ailment in the demi-monde he frequented, but for the heir to the throne, it was a disgrace. And then, in an act of staggering betrayal, he passed it on to his wife. The infection was catastrophic for Stephanie. In the age before antibiotics, gonorrhea was a brutal, incurable illness for women. It led to pelvic inflammatory disease, a chronic and agonizing condition that ravaged her reproductive organs, causing constant pain, fever, and internal abscesses. But the most critical consequence, the one that would echo through the halls of history, was that it rendered her permanently sterile. At the age of 22, the Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary could never have another child. The news was a dynastic bomb, a closely guarded state secret that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the court. Rudolf, the sole male heir of his generation, had personally extinguished any chance of producing a direct successor. He had failed in his most fundamental biological duty. The shame and guilt he must have felt were immense, but they were matched by his resentment. In his mind, the marriage was now not only an intellectual prison but a biological dead end. He now saw his marriage as an inescapable trap, a lifelong sentence with a woman who represented his ultimate failure. He blamed her for his entrapment, turning the guilt of his own actions outward in a torrent of bitterness. For Rudolf, the consequences were even darker. It is widely believed by historians that he was also suffering from the later stages of syphilis, a disease that attacks the brain and nervous system. Whether he inherited it congenitally or contracted it later, the disease, combined with the painful complications of his own gonorrhea, left him in a state of chronic, agonizing pain. He suffered from blinding headaches, crippling joint inflammation, and bouts of fever that would leave him weak and delirious. His handsome face grew pale and gaunt. His bright, intelligent eyes became clouded with pain. To manage the physical agony and the psychological torment, he turned to a new and insidious lover, morphine. What likely began as a medical prescription from a court doctor soon spiraled into a full-blown addiction. His valet, Joseph Loschek, became his enabler, administering daily injections that provided a temporary, hazy escape from a reality that had become unbearable. The once brilliant mind began to fray. The morphine, combined with heavy day-long drinking, created a toxic cocktail that ravaged his health and his sanity. His moods became dangerously erratic, swinging from moments of feverish energy and intellectual clarity to long periods of deep, morbid depression. He grew paranoid, convinced his political enemies were closing in on him. His lifelong melancholic fascination with death now hardened into a suicidal obsession. He was a man trapped in a feedback loop of pain. The physical agony of his diseases drove him to the morphine, and the morphine clouded his judgment, plunging him deeper into the psychological despair that made his life feel worthless. He was rotting from the inside out, and he knew it. His descent accelerated into a terrifying spiral. He was now an addict, reliant on daily injections to simply function. He drank cognac for breakfast and continued drinking heavily throughout the day. The once brilliant mind began to cloud over. His moods became erratic, swinging from feverish energy to deep suicidal depression. He grew paranoid and obsessed with death. He began carrying a revolver with him at all times and spoke openly to his friends about suicide as a rational, philosophical choice. The inner darkness of his childhood had returned, now amplified by disease, addiction, and a profound sense of failure. He was trapped in a failing body and a failed marriage, with no political hope and no escape. In his frantic search for escape, Rudolf found a fragile sense of stability in the arms of Mitzi Kasper. She was not a fleeting affair. She was a long-term companion, a high-class courtesan who offered him something he couldn't find anywhere else: non-judgmental acceptance. With Mitzi, he didn't have to be the crown prince. He could be just Rudolf, a broken, unhappy man. He bought her a lavish apartment and showered her with gifts. She was his confidant, the one person who saw the full extent of his despair. In the late autumn of 1888, his obsession with death crystallized into a concrete plan. He went to Mitzi's apartment one night, his mind clouded by alcohol and morphine. He brought with him a glass bowl filled with poison and his revolver. He laid them before her and made a chilling proposition. He told her that he could no longer bear to live, and he asked her to die with him, right there, right then, in a double suicide. Mitzi was terrified, but she was also a pragmatist. She tried to calm him down, gently refusing his macabre offer and trying to distract him with champagne. She saw that he was not just melancholic, he was seriously, dangerously unstable. The next day she did something incredibly brave. She went to the Vienna police and reported the incident. She warned them that the heir to the throne was actively suicidal, but her warning fell on deaf ears. The police couldn't or wouldn't believe that the future emperor was on the verge of a complete breakdown. They dismissed her report, likely viewing it as the hysterical ramblings of a dramatic mistress. The warning was ignored. The system, designed to protect the image of the crown prince at all costs, had failed to protect the man himself. This moment was a crucial turning point. Rudolf had now tried and failed to find a partner for his own destruction. His offer to Mitzi was a dress rehearsal for the tragedy to come. He was a man with a loaded gun, actively searching for someone willing to die with him. His rejection by Mitzi did not dissuade him. It simply meant he had to find another, more impressionable partner. He would not have to look for long. A 17-year-old baroness, consumed by a romantic obsession with the tragic prince, was about to step into the light. Her name was Mary Vetsera, and she would not say no. The political revolutionary had been defeated. The visionary reformer had been silenced. All that was left was Rudolf the man, a man cornered by his dynastic failures, consumed by physical pain, and haunted by a death wish that now actively sought a partner. He had failed to change the world, so now he would turn all that frustrated revolutionary energy inward, focusing it on the destruction of the one thing he still had control over, himself. The stage was now set for the final tragic act, where public despair would curdle into a private, deadly obsession. Baroness Mary Vetsera was not from the ancient, rarefied world of the high Habsburg aristocracy. She was a product of Vienna's ambitious second society. Her father, Baron Albin Vetsera, was a diplomat who had been granted his title for his service to the emperor. Her mother, the beautiful and formidable Helene Vetsera, was the daughter of a wealthy Greek financier from Constantinople. Helene's driving ambition was to see her children climb the social ladder, to penetrate the exclusive inner circle of the court. She groomed her daughter Mary for this purpose, dressing her in the latest Parisian fashions, teaching her the social graces and parading her at all the right events. Mary herself was a product of her time, a perfect vessel for the fin de siècle culture of romantic morbidity. The late 19th century was obsessed with tragic love and beautiful death. Operas ended with lovers dying in each other's arms. Poetry celebrated the beauty of decay. For a young, impressionable girl like Mary, love was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be a grand, all-consuming passion, and the most romantic love of all was one that ended in tragedy. And for Mary, the ultimate object of this romantic fantasy was Crown Prince Rudolf. He was, in modern terms, the biggest celebrity in the empire. He was handsome, dashing, and most alluringly, he was known to be deeply unhappy. He was the quintessential Byronic hero, a dark, brooding, misunderstood genius trapped in a gilded cage. Mary developed a fierce, obsessive crush on him. She collected his photographs, read gossip about his movements in the society pages, and dreamed of one day capturing the heart of this tragic prince. This was not the love of a mature woman. It was the all-consuming, fantasy-driven infatuation of a star-struck teenager, and it was this naivete that would make her so dangerous to herself, and so tragically perfect for Rudolf. The affair did not begin by chance. It was carefully engineered. The go-between was one of the most notorious figures in the Viennese court, Rudolf's own cousin, Countess Marie Larisch. The Countess was a schemer, constantly in debt and always looking for ways to curry favor with the crown prince. Knowing of Mary's obsession and Rudolf's promiscuity, she saw an opportunity. She arranged for their accidental first meeting at the Freudenau racecourse, and then began to ferry secret letters between them. Finally, in early November 1888, just a short time after Mitzi Kaspar had refused his suicide pact, Countess Larisch smuggled Mary into the Hofburg Palace for her first private rendezvous with the Crown Prince. For Mary, it was a dream come true. She was finally alone with her idol. For Rudolf, it was something else entirely. In this adoring, doe-eyed teenager, he saw not a future, but an ending. He saw someone whose romantic view of the world was so intense, she might just be willing to follow him not just into bed, but into the grave. Their affair lasted less than 3 months, a brief frantic period between November 1888 and January 1889. It was a relationship built on secrets and delusion. For Mary, it was the grand passion she had always read about. She was utterly consumed. She wrote to her friends in breathless prose about her love for him. She believed she was the only one who truly understood his tormented soul, and that their love was a transcendent bond far superior to his hollow marriage. Rudolf, in turn, showered her with gifts, but they were gifts with a dark symbolic meaning. He did not give her diamonds or pearls. Instead, he gave her a plain iron wedding ring, engraved with the date of their first meeting and the letters ILVBIDT, a German acronym for In Liebe vereint bis in den Tod, united in love until death. He also gave her a silver cigarette case inscribed with the words, a token of gratitude, and a portrait of himself in a locket. These were not the tokens of a man planning a life with a woman. They were the props for a death scene he was already writing in his mind. The recently discovered farewell letters Mary wrote just before her death give us an unprecedented, heartbreaking look into her psychology. She was not a passive victim being led to the slaughter. She was an active, even eager participant. Writing to her sister, she said, "We are both going blissfully into the uncertain beyond." She saw their suicide not as a tragedy, but as a triumph, the ultimate romantic gesture that would immortalize their love and free her tragic prince from his earthly suffering. She was a 17-year-old girl who had become so enmeshed in Rudolf's death wish that she had adopted it as her own. As the affair intensified, Helene Wetzera, Mary's ambitious mother, began to panic. She had hoped for a flirtation that might elevate her family's social standing, not a full-blown obsessive affair that could lead to ruin. She confronted Mary, but the girl was defiant. The situation was spiraling out of control, but it was already too late. Events were now moving with a terrifying momentum, driven by Rudolf's final desperate gamble. The point of no return came in the last week of January 1889. For months, Rudolf had been formally petitioning the Vatican for an annulment of his marriage to Stephanie, an idea his devoutly Catholic father found abhorrent. Now, armed with his new love for Mary, he decided to confront the emperor directly. The details of this final meeting are shrouded in secrecy, pieced together from eyewitness accounts of the aftermath, but it is clear that it was an unmitigated disaster. On January 26th, Franz Joseph summoned his son to his study. The emperor, almost certainly informed of the affair by his network of spies, was in a cold fury. He demanded that Rudolf account for his behavior, for the request for an annulment, for the public scandal of his affair with a teenage baroness, for his failure to perform his duties. The meeting devolved into a violent shouting match. Rudolf reportedly pleaded for his freedom, for a life away from the court with the woman he loved. The emperor was unmovable. He commanded Rudolf to end the affair with Mary Wetzera immediately. He forbade him from ever seeing her again. He told him to remember his duty to God, to his family, and to the empire. Rudolf left his father's study a broken man. Every door had now been slammed shut and bolted. His father would never grant him a divorce. His political ambitions were worthless. His life at court was an empty charade. The one escape he had fantasized about, a new life with a new love, had just been rendered impossible by the one authority he could not defy. The emperor had given him a command, but in his desperate, disordered state of mind, Rudolf interpreted it as a death sentence. If he could not live on his own terms, he would not live at all. The decision was made. All that remained was to execute the plan. The 2 days that followed were a blur of methodical preparation. Rudolf's actions were not those of a man in a fit of passionate rage, but of someone calmly and deliberately closing the book on his own life. He began by writing a series of farewell letters. To his long-suffering wife, Stephanie, he wrote a cold, almost clinical note, wishing her well. To his beloved younger sister, Valerie, he wrote a heartfelt and tragic goodbye. He penned notes to his friends and to his valet, leaving instructions for the aftermath. He then sent for the director of the court furniture depository and arranged to pay off all his outstanding personal debts. He wrote a new will, leaving the bulk of his non-dynastic property not to his wife or daughter, but to a fund for Viennese journalists, a final act of solidarity with the secret life he had treasured. His final encounter with his wife was chilling. On the evening of January 28th, just before a formal family dinner, he went to her rooms. According to her memoirs, he was pale and agitated, speaking morbidly about strange premonitions. He showed her his hands, asking her if she thought they had changed. Then he held up a mirror to her face, telling her enigmatically, "Soon you will be very beautiful." It was a bizarre, unsettling encounter that she would only understand in hindsight. That same evening, he made one final visit to Mitzi Kaspar, the woman who had refused to die with him. He didn't ask again. He simply sat with her for several hours, drinking heavily but saying little, lost in a silent, impenetrable despair. It was his way of saying goodbye and perhaps a final silent acknowledgement that his decision to die was about so much more than his doomed affair with Mary Wetzera. While he was putting his life in order, the plans for Mayerling were set in motion. He informed the court that he was going to his hunting lodge for a few days of shooting, inviting his brother-in-law, Prince Philip of Coburg, and a friend, Count Hoyos, to join him. It was the perfect cover. Under the guise of this ordinary aristocratic pastime, he arranged for Mary Wetzera to be brought to him. Countess Larish, their go-between, was given the task of smuggling Mary out of her mother's house and taking her to a waiting carriage, driven by Rudolf's trusted valet, Joseph Loschek. Mary, lying to her mother about a shopping trip, left her home for the last time. On the morning of January 29th, Rudolf and his guests arrived at the small, relatively modest hunting lodge of Mayerling, deep in the Vienna woods. The air was cold. The ground was covered in snow. The mood was tense. Rudolf tried to play the part of the cheerful host, but his friends noted his distraction and strange mood. He drank heavily throughout the day. Meanwhile, Loschek arrived with Mary and secreted her into the prince's private chambers, away from the eyes of his guests. The plan was working. That evening, Rudolf sat down for dinner with Hoyos and Coburg. He made his apologies, claiming he had a slight cold and needed to retire early. He bid them good night, leaving them to their wine, and slipped away to the bedroom where Mary was waiting. He instructed his valet, Loschek, not to be disturbed by anyone under any circumstances until 6:30 the next morning, and then he locked the door. Outside, the snow fell silently on the Vienna woods. Inside the lodge, his friends drank and talked, oblivious. And in the crown prince's bedchamber behind a locked door, a 30-year-old man, heir to an empire, and a 17-year-old girl, captive to a romantic fantasy, were finally alone. The stage was set. The final act of the tragedy of Crown Prince Rudolf was about to begin. Every escape route had been cut off. Every plea had been denied. The dutiful son, the secret rebel, the failed husband, and the visionary intellectual had all been silenced, leaving only a man driven by a singular, desperate need for an ending. He had methodically put his life in order, said his silent goodbyes, and arranged the final grim pieces on the board. All the secrets, lies, and private agonies of a lifetime had converged on this single night, in this single room. Now behind that locked door, the tragic story of Rudolf's life would find its horrifying conclusion. What happened inside that room is the subject of a century of speculation, but forensic evidence and the letters left behind allow us to piece together the final, terrible hours. The night was long. It is unlikely that death came quickly. Rudolf, ever the methodical intellectual, even in his final moments, likely spent hours putting his final thoughts in order. Based on the state of the bodies when they were found, the coroners concluded that Mary died first. The prevailing theory is that Rudolf shot her in the left temple as she sat on the bed. By all accounts, she was a willing participant, seeing this moment as the ultimate consummation of their tragic love. For Rudolf, it was an irrevocable act. He had now committed murder, severing his last tie to the world of law and duty. Forensic evidence suggests he then sat with her body for several hours as rigor mortis began to set in. We can only imagine the state of his mind in that silent, lamplit room, alone with the young woman he had killed, the weight of his entire failed life pressing down on him, the effects of morphine and alcohol creating a surreal, nightmarish calm. He was no longer a prince, no longer an heir. He was just a man at the end of his road. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, Rudolf picked up his revolver, placed the muzzle to his right temple, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot that ended his life would echo for 30 years, until it was answered by another in Sarajevo. Morning, January 30th, 6:30 a.m. Joseph Loschek, Rudolf's loyal valet, stands outside the locked bedroom door. The silence from within the room is absolute and unnatural. A cold fear begins to creep in. He goes to find Rudolf's guests, Prince Philip of Coburg and Count Hoyos. Panic now sets in. Finally, Count Hoyos makes the decision. He orders Loschek to fetch an axe and smash the door panel. The scene that greets them is one of Gothic horror. The room is semi-dark. The air is thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. On the bed, they can just make out the pale form of a woman motionless. Slumped beside the bed is the crown prince, a pool of blood congealing on the floor beneath his shattered skull. The discovery triggered an immediate and desperate attempt to control the narrative. This wasn't a matter of grief. It was a matter of state security. The first instinct was not to mourn, but to conceal. It fell to the Empress Sisi to tell the emperor that his son and his entire dynasty's future was dead. Franz Joseph's personal grief was immediately sublimated by his imperial duty. The cover-up began within minutes. The first official announcement was that Rudolf had died from a heart aneurysm. It was a lie. As the truth began to leak, they settled on the final official story. The crown prince had taken his own life while in a state of mental imbalance. This was a political strategy, a fiction crafted to persuade the Pope to allow a Catholic burial. The image of the dynasty was more important than the truth. But what about Mary Vitsera? To the court, she was a piece of scandalous evidence that had to be disposed of. The treatment of her body is the most shocking part of the affair. Her corpse was dressed, propped up in a carriage between her two uncles, and driven through the night to the monastery of Heiligenkreuz, where she was buried in a secret, unmarked grave. The court had successfully erased her from the story. The official story never satisfied anyone, and into the vacuum rushed a century of conspiracy theories. Was it political assassination by German or French agents? A drunken brawl gone wrong? A botched abortion? The mystery took a bizarre turn in 1991 when Mary Vitsera's remains were secretly exhumed. A subsequent forensic examination confirmed she died from a single gunshot wound, which aligns with the suicide pact story, but it cannot explain the ultimate motive. The secrets of that room ultimately died with them. The immediate aftermath of Mayerling was a private apocalypse for the imperial family. Empress Sisi never recovered, wearing only black until her own assassination in 1898. Emperor Franz Joseph retreated even further into the rigid shell of his duty, but the true consequences were global. With Rudolf dead, the line of succession was shattered. It passed to his aging uncle Karl Ludwig, who quickly renounced his claim in favor of his own eldest son, and that son was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This is the moment where the path to World War I begins. Crown Prince Rudolf, for all his flaws, was a liberal. He was a diplomat who foresaw a catastrophic European war and was desperate to avoid it. His death removed the last best hope for peaceful change within the empire. In his place stood Franz Ferdinand, a proud arch-conservative autocrat. He became the living symbol of Habsburg oppression. He became a target. The line is direct and chilling. The gunshot at Mayerling in 1889 put Franz Ferdinand in line for the throne, and his position as heir is what took him to Sarajevo on that fateful day, June 28, 1914. The assassin's bullet that killed Franz Ferdinand was the spark that ignited the First World War, but the fuse had been lit 25 years earlier in a locked room in the Vienna woods. The private despair of one man created the vacuum that would be filled by another, whose death would pull 20 million people into the abyss. When we look back at the rubble of history, it's tempting to search for grand, simple narratives. But the story of Crown Prince Rudolf is not a romance, it is a cautionary tale. It is the story of how the secrets and pathologies of a single family, the Habsburgs, became the pathologies of an entire continent. The empire, like its ruling family, suffered from a fatal inability to face reality. Rudolf was a victim of his brutal upbringing, of his heredity, of a political system that had no room for his vision. He was a man born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The tragedy of Mayerling is not that two young lovers died. The tragedy is that a possible more peaceful future for Europe died with them. Rudolf's legacy is a ghost, a haunting what if, that hangs over the entire 20th century. He is the forgotten man at the heart of the modern world's original trauma. His life shrouded in secrets and his death buried under a mountain of lies stand as a testament to the terrifying power of a single private tragedy to change the fate of all humanity. The gunshot was followed by a desperate official silence, a cover-up designed to preserve a fragile illusion of stability. That culture of silencing uncomfortable truths would be the empire's undoing. The echo of that gunshot at Mayerling has never truly faded. We are still living in